There are places in this country where the silence is so complete, it stops feeling like quiet and starts feeling like something else entirely. Not the absence of sound. Something more deliberate than that. Something that has weight to it, the way a held breath has weight. National parks look different after dark. The visitors go home, the parking lots empty out, the rangers lock the gates, and what's left behind is something that doesn't belong to us anymore. Maybe it never did. We just walk through it during the daylight hours and tell ourselves we understand it because we gave it a name on a map. I worked a night shift in one of those places for about 4 months. I want to tell you what happened there. Not to warn you, exactly. More because I've been carrying it long enough that I need to put it down somewhere. Set it on a table where someone else can look at it. Maybe you'll make more sense of it than I ever did. My name doesn't matter. What I did there, and what I saw there, and what I'm still not entirely sure how to account for, that's what matters. So if you're ready, I'll start at the beginning. Main story part soap 2. The way I got the job was almost embarrassingly ordinary. My wife and I had separated. Not divorced, separated, which is its own particular kind of limbo. And I found myself living in a rented room in a town I had no real attachment to, with more time on my hands than was good for me, and a bank account that needed attention. I was 61. I had worked 30 years in facilities management for a university system, and I knew how to keep buildings running and how to move through large, complex physical spaces without making too much noise or calling too much attention to myself. That turns out to be a useful skill set for night security work. I found the listing through a contractor that handles seasonal and supplemental staffing for several national park units in the region. The position was straightforward on paper. Overnight presence at a visitor services complex within a large park, monitoring cameras, doing 2 perimeter walks per shift, maintaining a log, calling a specific number if anything required human intervention. The nearest town with a full-service gas station was about 22 miles away. The nearest town with a hospital was closer to 40. The pay was modest but included a small on-site housing unit, which solved my immediate problem. I applied, got a phone interview, passed a background check, and 3 weeks later I drove a truck with most of what I owned in the bed up a 2-lane road into the park. This was mid-September. The trees were just starting to turn. The light at that time of year in that part of the country has a particular quality to it. Amber and long and slightly melancholy, and I remember thinking that it suited my state of mind pretty well. I was not in a good place emotionally, but I was functional. I want to be clear about that. I was not someone in crisis. I was someone in the particular middle-aged kind of sadness that is mostly just exhaustion and regret. And what I wanted most was a quiet place to work and think and put some time between myself and the decisions that had gotten me to that rented room. I got the quiet place. I got that. The visitor services complex was a cluster of 4 buildings. The main visitor center, a gift shop, and bookstore that shared a building, a small maintenance and storage facility, and the housing unit I'd be living in. The housing unit was a converted ranger quarters from the early 1980s. 2 rooms and a bathroom, functional and clean, with a window in the main room that looked out toward the tree line about 80 yards away. There was a small covered porch with 2 chairs on it, which I appreciated. I'm a man who likes to sit outside in the evening. The day supervisor was a woman named Carla. She was probably 55, solid and no nonsense. The kind of person who has spent enough years in institutional settings that she'd developed a useful economy of language. She showed me around on my first afternoon, explained the camera system, walked me through the log format, gave me the emergency number and the non-emergency maintenance number and the number for the park's own security office, which maintained a patrol vehicle that covered the entire park and could be at my location in anywhere from 20 to 45 minutes, depending on where they were when I called. She also showed me the walking route for the perimeter checks. The complex sat in a cleared area, and the perimeter walk followed a gravel path that went around all 4 buildings and came back to the main entrance. It took about 12 minutes at a comfortable pace. I was expected to do it twice per shift, once around 11 at night and once around 3 in the morning. She showed me where the flashlight chargers were, explained that the motion sensor lights on the exterior of the main building sometimes triggered on deer, and that I should log it but not be alarmed by it, and told me that in her experience, the job was about 90% sitting at a desk, watching a screen with nothing happening. I asked her what the other 10% was. She said, deer, raccoons, occasionally a couple of drunk campers who wandered the wrong direction from the campground. She said it without hesitation. I believed her completely. At that point, I had no reason not to. She walked me to her car and then stopped and turned back, the way people do when they've almost forgotten something. She said there was one more thing. She said that the park had a long-standing informal policy among the overnight staff, which was that if you heard sounds coming from the direction of the tree line after midnight, you were to log them, but you were not to go out and investigate them beyond the established perimeter path. She said this matter-of-factly, the way you'd explain that the copy machine on the 3rd floor jams if you use paper heavier than 24-pound stock. She said the Park Service had documented wildlife activity in the corridor beyond the tree line, and that it was simply not safe to enter that area in the dark without daylight backup and a radio that could reach the main dispatch. I nodded. That made complete sense to me. I'm not a young man looking to prove something in the woods at 2 in the morning. I had no objection to that policy. I thanked her. She drove away. I went inside and unpacked. For the first 3 weeks, the job was exactly what she'd described. I sat at the desk in the main visitor center from 9 at night until 5 in the morning, watching 6 camera feeds on a split monitor, logging anything that moved, doing my perimeter walks, and spending the quiet hours between those walks reading or listening to the radio or writing letters to my wife that I mostly didn't send. The deer triggered the motion lights a handful of times each night. I logged them. A family of raccoons had apparently decided that the space under the gift shop building was their permanent residence, and their comings and goings across Camera 3 became a kind of nightly entertainment. The park security officer, a younger man who came by every few nights on his rounds, was named Dennis. He was pleasant and unhurried. We'd exchange a few words when he stopped in, drink coffee from the machine in the break room, and he'd be on his way. It was in the 4th week that the first thing happened. I want to be careful how I describe it, because when I say it plainly, it sounds like almost nothing at all. And that's partly the point. That's what made it difficult to explain to myself at the time and to other people later. I was on my 11 o'clock perimeter walk. It was early October by this point, and the temperature had dropped significantly from when I'd arrived. The nights were cold now, proper cold, with a clarity in the air that made the stars look closer than they have any right to be. I had my flashlight, and I was moving along the south side of the maintenance building, which is the side that faces most directly toward the tree line. The tree line at night from that position was a dark wall about 80 yards out, and beyond the reach of any of the exterior lights, it was essentially solid black. I wasn't looking at it particularly. I was doing the walk the way I always did it, checking that the building doors were latched, making sure nothing was disturbed. And then I stopped. I stopped because I had the very clear and immediate sense that something was standing at the tree line, looking at me. I want to be precise here, because this kind of thing is easy to overdramatize, and I want to resist that. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement I saw. It was a perceptual shift, the same quality of awareness you get when someone enters a room you're in from behind you, even before you hear their footsteps. A change in the texture of the air, maybe. A difference in the quality of the darkness at that particular distance. I've tried to find a more precise way to describe it over the years, and I haven't found one. I turned my flashlight toward the tree line. The beam reached maybe 60 feet. The tree line was 80 yards out. I was illuminating ground cover and dried grass and nothing else. I stood there for probably 30 seconds, which feels like a long time when you're standing still in the cold dark, aiming a flashlight at nothing. Then I completed my walk, went back inside, and logged the time. I wrote, "Perimeter clear. No disturbances," because there hadn't been any disturbances. There had been a feeling, and feelings don't go in the log. I sat back down at the desk and picked up my book and did not think about it again for the rest of the night. But the next night at 11 o'clock I stopped at the same spot on the same side of the maintenance building, and I had the same sensation. Identical. The same sense of directed attention from the tree line. I turned my flashlight, nothing visible. I stood for 30 seconds. I completed the walk. On the third night, I told myself I wasn't going to stop at that spot. I was going to keep moving, maintain my pace, complete the walk without any deviation. And I did that. I kept walking. And when I passed that particular point on the south side of the maintenance building, the sensation was so strong and so immediate that I actually flinched. Not stopped, flinched. My stride broke for about half a second, and then I recovered and kept going. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the nature of what this was. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was a small, persistent, entirely private thing that I had no framework for and no one to discuss it with. I didn't call Dennis. I didn't call the non-emergency maintenance line. I didn't call Carla. What was I going to say? I go outside at 11 o'clock every night and I have a feeling. These are not the words of a person who keeps a job. So I did what practical people do. I noted it internally, I kept it to myself, and I adjusted. I started doing my 11 o'clock walk slightly earlier, around 10:40, to see if the timing made any difference. It did not. I tried walking faster past that section. The sensation persisted, slightly compressed in time but identical in character. I tried walking with my flashlight aimed at the tree line continuously from the moment I rounded the corner of the maintenance building. I could see the tree line clearly the entire time. Nothing was standing there that I could see. And yet the sensation of being observed was the most consistent thing in my life at that point. More consistent than anything else in those first weeks. More consistent than my sleep schedule or my meals or the letters I was writing to my wife. I began to pay attention to the trees themselves. This was not a dramatic decision. I didn't set up a surveillance operation or start keeping a separate log. I simply started noticing things I hadn't noticed before because I was paying a different kind of attention. The tree line along the south edge of the clearing was mixed hardwood and some pine, not particularly dense at the edge, but thickening quickly as it moved away from the clearing. The nearest trees were mostly young tulip poplars, maybe 50 to 60 years old, straight-trunked with their lower branches starting 8 or 10 feet up. Between them, in the darkness, there were gaps. During the day, I started looking at those gaps, not going out to them. I stayed well within the cleared area, but looking at them from the porch of my housing unit and from the window of the visitor center during my shift handovers in the morning and evening. They were just gaps between trees, darkness and leaves and the suggestion of depth beyond. There was nothing visually remarkable about them whatsoever. What I started to notice was that during my 11 o'clock walk, when I was passing the south side of the maintenance building, the gaps at the tree line seemed different at night than they did during the day. This sounds like I'm describing an obvious feature of darkness, and that's fair. But I want to try to be more precise than that. During the day, the gaps were uniformly dark, just the shadowed interior of the woods. At night, from where I stood on the perimeter path, some of the gaps were darker than others, not in a way I could quantify, not in a way I could point to and measure, but with a consistency that I began to map in my head after enough nights of observing it. A particular gap between two of the larger tulip poplars, roughly centered in the south-facing tree line, was consistently darker than the gaps on either side of it. I told myself this was the geometry of the tree canopy creating differential shadow. I still think that's probably what it was. I'm not telling you it was anything other than that. I'm telling you what I noticed, and what I felt when I noticed it, which was the same thing I felt every night at that spot on the perimeter walk. A cold, precise, entirely unwelcome sense of being the subject of something's attention. About 5.5 weeks into the job, something changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way I could put in the log. But the change was real, and I knew it the moment it happened. I was on my 3 o'clock walk. The 3 o'clock walk was different from the 11 o'clock walk in ways that were hard to articulate, but immediately felt by anyone who's worked nights in an isolated location. 11 o'clock is the beginning of the dark. 3 o'clock is the bottom of it. The world at 3 o'clock in the morning, in a location 22 miles from the nearest gas station, has a quality of remove from ordinary human life that is not frightening, exactly, but that commands a certain kind of respect. You understand at 3 o'clock in the morning that if something went wrong, you would be alone with it for a while before anyone could get to you. I was rounding the northwest corner of the visitor center, which was the back corner, the part of the building farthest from my desk and farthest from the main entrance. I was midway through the perimeter walk, on the far side of the loop from the maintenance building, and I heard something. It was not an animal sound. I want to be clear about that, because the first thing you do, the first thing any reasonable person does, is run through the catalog of wildlife sounds and try to find a match. I had been listening to this forest for more than 5 weeks at that point. I had heard deer moving through the brush, which has a particular rhythm to it, an abruptness, a stop-and-start quality. I had heard what I was fairly sure were coyotes on 2 occasions. Farther out, that particular high, thin sound that carries across distance in a way that makes you aware of distance. I had heard owls and wind in the canopy, and the various small sounds that the buildings themselves made as they contracted in the cold. This was none of those things. It was a sound from the direction of the tree line, the east side of the complex this time, not the south side. And what it sounded like, as plainly as I can put it, was something exhaling. A long, slow, controlled exhalation, the kind a person makes when they are trying to be quiet and failing slightly. Not a snort, not the sharp exhalation of a startled deer. A deliberate, controlled breath. I stopped. I aimed my flashlight toward the east tree line. The east tree line was closer to the buildings than the south, maybe 60 yards from where I was standing. The beam reached it clearly. Nothing. I stood there for perhaps a full minute. I heard nothing else. The forest was quiet, which in my experience means either that nothing is there or that everything has gone still because something is. I completed the walk. I went inside. I sat at my desk for a while without picking up my book. At 5 in the morning when the day shift arrived, a young woman named Priya, who I'd gotten along with well, I asked her, as casually as I could, whether she'd ever heard any unusual sounds on the grounds at night. She looked at me for a moment in the specific way that people look at you when they are deciding how much to say. She said, "What kind of unusual?" I described what I'd heard. The long, controlled exhalation. The direction it came from. She nodded slowly, and then she said something that has stayed with me in its precise unhelpfulness. She said, "There's a lot of wildlife in that corridor that doesn't come out during the day." And then she went to get her coffee, and we didn't talk about it again. I want to tell you what I noticed in that moment, because I think it's important. She didn't dismiss it. She didn't laugh. She didn't tell me I was tired or that I'd imagined it. She nodded, and then she said the most locally accepted explanation she could find, and then she moved on. That's not the behavior of someone who thinks you've heard a deer. The sound happened again on the following Thursday. Same time, same location, same quality. Long, slow, deliberate. I logged it this time. I wrote, 031, possible large wildlife in East Corridor. Single vocalization. That's the most accurate description I could give it within the language the log provided for. Dennis came by that Friday. We drank coffee. I mentioned the log entry casually and asked if the park had been having any unusual wildlife activity in my area. He looked at the entry, looked up at me, and said that the park had documented black bear movement in several corridors in the fall, and that if I was concerned, I should make noise on my perimeter walks to avoid any close encounters. I thanked him. That wasn't what I'd heard, and we both probably knew it, but I appreciated the pragmatism of the exchange. We were both, I think, operating within the limits of what we were prepared to say out loud. October passed into November. The trees shed most of their leaves, and the cleared area around the complex opened up visually in a way that should have felt less enclosed but didn't. With the leaves down, I could see deeper into the tree line during the day, and at night the stripped branches created a different quality of darkness. Not the solid wall of summer canopy, but something more layered, more subdivided, more like a room with furniture in it than a wall. And I found that this new visibility made the 11 o'clock sensation worse rather than better. With the leaves down, I could see there was nothing standing at the tree line, and the sensation persisted exactly as before, which meant that whatever was generating it was either genuinely invisible or genuinely not there. And I was spending my nights in the company of my own uncorroborated perception. I want to tell you about the camera on the south side of the maintenance building, because this is where things become harder to explain, and I'm going to do my best. The camera system had 6 feeds. Camera 4 was positioned at the southeast corner of the maintenance building, angled to cover the south face of the building, and a portion of the cleared area extending toward the tree line. Its field of view reached approximately 50 to 55 yards. The tree line, as I mentioned, was at 80 yards. So camera 4 showed the cleared area in front of the tree line, but not the tree line itself. The image was black and white in low light mode, reasonably sharp, and I had been watching it every night for almost 2 months, without it showing me anything I couldn't account for. On a Tuesday night in the second week of November, at approximately 11:40, about 40 minutes after I'd completed my perimeter walk, Camera 4 showed me something I couldn't account for. In the upper right corner of the frame, at what I estimated was the extreme range of the camera's field of view, there was a density. That's the best word I have for it. Not a shape, or not a clearly defined shape, not a figure. A region of the frame that was darker than the surrounding darkness. About 3 to 4 feet wide at the widest point I could measure against the background, roughly vertical in orientation. It was there for approximately 40 seconds, and then it was not there. I watched the rest of that hour of footage and did not see it again. I rewound and watched the 40-second segment 4 times. I wrote in the log, Camera 4, 2342, possible visual obstruction in upper right frame, wildlife or vegetation movement, duration 40 seconds. Could not determine source. I called Dennis's non-emergency number the following morning and left a voicemail asking him to take a look at the Camera 4 footage from the previous night when he had a chance. He called me back that afternoon and said he'd looked at it, and that his best read was a deer at the edge of the frame, possibly angled away from the camera, which would explain the elongated vertical shape and the lack of clear outline. He said the low-light camera had a tendency to create compression artifacts at long range that could distort the apparent shape of large animals. I said that made sense. He said to call if I saw it again. I said I would. I saw it again 11 days later, same approximate location in the frame, this time for just under 2 minutes. And this time, during the 46 seconds that I sat watching it, it moved. Not quickly, not dramatically. A lateral shift of perhaps 18 inches over the course of those 46 seconds, slow enough that I wasn't entirely sure I was seeing it until I lined up a tree trunk in the background as a reference point and watched the density pass slowly in front of it. I logged it. I did not call Dennis that night. I told myself it was because it was 3 in the morning and the non-emergency number was for daytime use. That was true. It was also true that I was not sure what I would say that I hadn't already said. Something was in the cleared area south of the maintenance building. It appeared on camera intermittently, after midnight, and it moved with the lateral pace of something that was not in a hurry. It did not appear on camera 1, which covered the area in front of the main visitor center. It did not appear on camera 3, which covered the front of the gift shop. It appeared on camera 4, which was the camera closest to the tree line. I began logging each appearance meticulously in my own private notebook, separate from the official log, which I kept in the drawer of my desk. Date, time, duration, estimated position, movement observed. By the time I left that job in mid-January, I had 16 entries in that notebook. I still have the notebook. I've looked at it periodically over the years, not to understand it any better. I've accepted that I'm not going to understand it better, but to confirm that it's still there, that it's still real, that I didn't make it up. The thing that happened in late November is what I would call the midpoint of all of this. The moment when I stopped being able to tell myself that what I was experiencing was a collection of unrelated, individually explainable events. Because isolated events can always be explained. When they start finding each other, when they start forming a sequence with a logic to it, that's when you understand that you are dealing with something coherent. I had been sitting at my desk at close to 1 in the morning, watching the feeds, when I noticed that the density was present on camera 4 again. This had become almost routine by this point. I noted it, checked the other cameras, confirmed no movement elsewhere, watched camera 4. What was different that night was the duration. It stayed in frame for 11 minutes. In all my previous log entries, the longest duration had been the 2-minute appearance in early November. 11 minutes was not a difference in degree. It felt like a difference in kind. And then, near the end of those 11 minutes, it stopped moving laterally. It had been doing its characteristic slow drift from right to left across the upper portion of the frame, and then it stopped. And it oriented, or I perceived it as orienting, which is not the same thing. I understand that. Toward the camera, I want to be careful here. I know that cameras don't have feelings. I know that shapes on a screen don't have intentionality. I know that what I'm about to describe is my perception of the footage and not an objective fact about it. But I'm telling you what I experienced sitting at that desk. And what I experienced was the clear bodily sensation that the thing on camera 4 had, in that moment, noticed the camera, and through the camera noticed me. The density remained stationary for another 4 minutes. Then it was gone. I sat at my desk for a long time after that. I did my 3 o'clock perimeter walk because I was not going to give up my routine. I was frightened, I'll say it plainly, and I was not going to let fear change my behavior, because I have found over the years that when you change your behavior in response to fear, you have given something a kind of authority over you. But I will tell you that on that 3 o'clock walk, on the south side of the maintenance building, I did not slow down or stop. I walked my pace, and I kept my flashlight aimed straight ahead, and I did not look at the tree line. Not because I thought I would see something, because I was no longer certain I wouldn't. I'm going to tell you about the morning of November 28th, which was the day after Thanksgiving, because this is where the story moves from the camera and the sensation and the sounds into something that required me to make a decision about what I was going to do with what I knew. I finished my shift at 5 in the morning as usual, but Priya was late arriving. A flat tire on the access road she called ahead, so I stayed until nearly 6. I was outside on the porch of my housing unit, drinking coffee and watching the light come up, which I always enjoyed. That particular shift of the sky from black to the very dark blue that precedes dawn, and then to the pale gray that is the actual beginning of morning. The tree line was visible by then as a dark mass against the lighter sky. I was looking at the south tree line without any particular intensity when I saw the path, or what I think was a path. A break in the undergrowth at the base of the tree line, roughly centered in the south-facing edge of the woods, approximately 4 feet wide. It was only visible because the dawn light was coming from the east and creating a raking angle across the ground that showed me topographic detail I couldn't see at other times of day. The break in the undergrowth ran from the tree line toward the complex for a distance that I could follow with my eyes for perhaps 30 or 40 feet before the angle of the light made it invisible. I looked at it for a while, then I went inside. I want to explain why I didn't go out and look at it more closely, because the answer is more complicated than I was afraid. I was afraid, that's true, but the more honest reason was Carla's instruction on my first day. Don't investigate sounds from the tree line direction after midnight. The spirit of that instruction, as I understood it, extended to anything having to do with the area immediately adjacent to the tree line. I had been given a boundary. I had agreed to it. And now I was looking at something that was pulling at my curiosity with considerable force, and I was choosing not to follow it, not because I was forbidden to, but because I had made a calculation that following it would cross a line I had agreed to keep. I also want to tell you the truth about what was in my mind in that moment, which was this. I had the feeling, and again I want to be careful to call it a feeling, that going out to look at that path would constitute something, not just a physical action, something more like a response. And I was not willing to respond, not because I knew what responding would mean, but because on some level I had begun to understand that a response was what was being waited for. I told Priya about the path when she arrived. I described where it was and what it looked like from the porch. She looked at me steadily for a moment and then looked out toward the tree line, squinting a little in the early light. She said that the grounds crew sometimes cleared brush along the perimeter for fire management. She said it in the tone of someone who is aware that what they're saying does not quite fit the question they were asked. I said, "In fire management season." She said, "They do all kinds of things." After that, she went inside, and I drove to the nearest town for groceries and supplies, and spent the afternoon doing the kinds of errands that ground a person in ordinary life, when ordinary life is in need of support. I bought coffee and food, and a new pair of work gloves, and a paperback novel I'd been meaning to read. I had a meal at a diner and watched people come and go, and listened to conversations about normal things. It helped. December arrived, and the cold became serious. The nights dropped below freezing, and the cleared area around the complex acquired a hard white quality by the first weeks of the month. Frost on the ground each morning, the breath visible on the perimeter walks. The tree line looked different in December. The stripped hardwoods were fully bare, and even in the dark you could see into the woods to a depth that summer made impossible. Some mornings before the dawn light came up fully, I would stand on my porch and look into those woods and see back 30, 40, maybe 50 yards, all the way to where the slope of the ground dropped away and the terrain became unclear. Nothing moved in there that I could identify, but the stillness of it had a quality that was not restful, a stillness that was not emptiness. That is the best I can do. Dennis stopped by in the first week of December, and we had one of our coffee conversations. And this time I made a more direct approach to the subject than I had previously. I asked him if he knew the history of the grounds around the complex, whether there had been any structures out in the corridor to the south before the park was established. He said he didn't know off the top of his head that the park had absorbed a number of private land holdings over the decades of its existence, and that some of the old property lines and former use paths were still visible in the terrain, if you knew what you were looking for. I asked him whether any of the prior overnight staff at the complex had ever filed incident reports about the area south of the maintenance building. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite neutral. It was the same quality of expression that Priya had used. That slight recalibration, that brief assessment. He said that he wouldn't have access to historical incident reports going back more than a few years, and that if I had a specific concern, I should document it in my official log and submit it through the contractor. I thanked him. He said, before he left, that the Park Service generally recommended that overnight staff not spend too much time focused on any single area of their monitoring zone. He said it in the tone of a standard operational recommendation, the kind of thing that might be in a training manual somewhere. He said that tunnel vision, his words, was a recognized issue in overnight monitoring work, and that it was good practice to distribute your attention evenly. I said I understood. He said, "It's a big park. There's a lot out there." He said it simply, without drama. He meant it as reassurance, I think. But the way it landed like the other thing. The thing that it might also mean if you were inclined to think about it differently. There's a lot out there, and you don't want to spend too much time looking at any particular piece of it. I drove him to his vehicle and watched him go and stood in the cold air for a moment before going back inside. In the second week of December, the path got closer. I am not using that phrase loosely. What I mean is that when I looked at the south tree line from my porch, on the morning of December 13th, the break in the undergrowth that I had first noticed on the day after Thanksgiving now extended several yards further out of the tree line than it had before. The raking dawn light was my guide again, and I am sufficiently certain about what I saw on each occasion that I can state it plainly. The path from the tree line toward the complex was longer in December than it had been in November. Not by a dramatic amount, by perhaps 10 or 12 feet, but the direction of extension was toward the buildings. I looked at it for a long time. Then I went and got my official log, and I wrote, "Grounds observation. Possible change in cleared area south of maintenance building. Recommend grounds, crew inspection." I wrote it in the most institutional language I had because I wanted it on record, and I wanted it to sound like a facilities concern, which is what it was, at least in part. I never received any response to that log entry. Whether it was read, whether it was forwarded, I do not know. The camera appearances on 4 continued. They were not frequent, perhaps once or twice a week, but they had become longer in duration. My private log recorded appearances of 14 minutes, 22 minutes. On one night in mid-December, 31 minutes. The density moved slowly across the upper portion of the frame, always in the area closest to the tree line edge of the camera's range. But on 2 occasions in December it appeared further into the frame, closer to the buildings, than it had in October and November. Not dramatically closer, but measurably closer when I used the fixed reference points of the building corners and my knowledge of the camera angle to estimate distance. I want to talk about what I was feeling during this period, because I think the emotional dimension of it is as important as the factual sequence, and I've been somewhat sparse about it up to now. I was not sleeping well. This is probably obvious given everything else, but I want to name it. I was doing my shift, going back to the housing unit at 5:30, lying down, and spending 2 or 3 hours in a kind of anxious semi-sleep before giving up and reading or making phone calls. I called my wife twice during this period. We had conversations that were cautious and warm, the kind of conversations that 2 people have when they are both aware that something important is unresolved between them and are choosing to set it aside temporarily in favor of something more comfortable. She asked how the job was. I said it was quiet. That was true in one sense and almost funny in another. I was also not eating particularly well, not severely. I wasn't losing weight or neglecting myself. But the mechanical quality of preparing meals for one person in a 2-room converted ranger quarters in December, when you're not sleeping right, has a particular kind of gray flatness to it. I was functional. I was managing. But I was thinner at the margins than I wanted to be. What I was not was frightened in the active adrenaline way. That's important to say. What I was experiencing was something more like a sustained, low-frequency alertness that never entirely resolved. The kind of state you sustain when you have been waiting for something for a long time, and the waiting itself has become the condition of your life. I was alert. I was paying attention. And the paying attention was slowly reshaping the texture of my days in ways I did not fully notice until later, from the outside. I started spending more time at the window in my housing unit that faced the tree line. Not obsessively, but after meals in the afternoon, I would stand at that window for 10 or 15 minutes looking at the south edge of the woods. Not because I expected to see anything, because I had developed a habit of attention toward that specific direction that I was not consciously choosing to maintain. It was maintaining itself. In the 3rd week of December, I found something on the path. I want to be careful about how I tell this part because what I found was small and in itself unremarkable. And the significance of it is entirely in its location and its implications, not in the object itself. I had gone out in the early afternoon, proper daylight, clear sky, reasonable cold, to look at the path from a closer distance. I had not entered the tree line. I had walked along the cleared area to the point nearest to the path's terminus, which by this point extended perhaps 30 to 35 feet out from the tree line edge, and I had stood at what I judged to be a safe and reasonable distance from the path's end, and looked at it. The path was real. I want to say that clearly, because I had spent considerable mental energy in the preceding weeks maintaining the possibility that what I was seeing from my porch was an artifact of light angle, or the natural distribution of ground cover. Standing 7 feet from its end, I could see that it was not. The undergrowth along the south tree line, dried grasses, low scrub, the remnants of summer vegetation, was consistently clear for a width of about 4 feet along the path's entire length, in a way that was visually distinct from the surrounding undisturbed ground. Something had cleared it repeatedly over time. The soil along the path's center was compressed in a way that the surrounding soil was not. At the end of the path, at its farthest point from the tree line, there was a stone. It was an ordinary stone, roughly the size of a man's fist, gray, with a slightly irregular surface. The kind of stone that exists in uncountable millions in any terrain where geology has done its work. There was nothing unusual about the stone itself. What was unusual was its placement. It was sitting at the precise terminus of the path, centered on it, upright, not lying on its side the way a dropped or rolled stone would lie, but sitting with its flat face up, as though it had been placed. I looked at it for a while. I did not touch it. I went back inside. I had 2 weeks left on my contracted period. Mid-January was my end date, with an option to renew. I had been intending to renew. I was no longer certain about that. I called my wife that evening and had one of our careful conversations, and somewhere in the middle of it she said, "Are you all right?" Not in the casual way. In the particular way that means she was paying attention to something she'd heard in my voice. I said I was fine. She said, "You don't sound it." I said the job was a little more isolating than I'd expected. She said she was sorry to hear that, and she meant it, and the warmth of her meaning, it went all the way through me in a way that the cold of December and the weight of those weeks had not allowed for previously. We talked for another hour. When I hung up, I sat in the dark for a while and thought about ordinary life, its components, its textures, the specific weight of a normal day, and felt for the first time in weeks the true distance between where I was and where ordinary life happened. The stone was gone the next morning. I walked out at first light before my shift ended and looked at the path from the cleared area. The terminus of the path was bare. The stone was not there. I had not gone out at night. I had not moved it. Whether an animal had moved it or whether it had been moved by something else, I cannot tell you. I logged it. I wrote, "Grounds inspection. Object previously noted at perimeter path terminus no longer present." And then I sat at my desk and watched the camera feeds for the last 2 hours of my shift and thought with considerable clarity about what I was going to do. The last thing that happened before I made my decision occurred on a Saturday night in the final week of my contract. I was on my 3 o'clock walk. The night was clear and extremely cold, perhaps 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that made the exposed skin of my face ache. The cleared area was white with frost. My breath came out in visible clouds. I was wearing my heavy coat and my gloves, and I was moving at a brisk pace because of the cold. I was on the south side of the maintenance building, the familiar spot. I was not going to slow down. I was not going to look at the tree line. I was going to complete the walk efficiently and get back inside. From the direction of the tree line, I heard my name. I am going to say that again so that it registers properly. From the direction of the tree line, at 3 o'clock in the morning, in a national park 22 miles from the nearest town, I heard my name. It was not a shout. It was not dramatic. It was at a volume that suggested a person standing perhaps 30 yards away and speaking in a normal, moderate voice, the way you'd address someone across a room. My name, spoken once. The voice had no identifiable character. I mean that specifically. When I think back on it, and I have thought back on it many times, I cannot extract from the memory any quality of gender or age or emotional affect. It was simply my name in the air, precise, unambiguous. I stopped. I stood perfectly still. I did not turn my flashlight toward the tree line. I understood in that moment, with a clarity that surprised me with its steadiness, that I was not going to turn toward it. That turning toward it was the response. That turning toward it was the thing that had been waited for, through all of the October walks and the November camera appearances and the December path and the stone. I stood still for what felt like a very long time, probably 45 seconds. Then I turned, facing away from the tree line, and completed the rest of the perimeter walk. I went inside. I sat at my desk. I watched the camera feeds. Camera 4 showed nothing that night. I did not sleep when my shift ended. I called the contractor number at 7 in the morning and told them I would not be renewing my contract. They said they understood, that it happened, that they'd arrange a handoff with the next staff member. I asked when the next staff member was scheduled to start, and they said 2 weeks after my end date, which was a gap I hadn't expected. I offered to extend by a week so that the gap was shorter. I don't entirely know why I made that offer. It may have been guilt. It may have been practicality. It may have been some calculation about the next person that I was doing without fully admitting to myself. They took me up on the week extension. I spoke to Carla when she came in that morning. I told her I was not renewing. She nodded, unsurprised, and asked if there was anything I wanted to put on record before I left. I looked at her for a moment. She had been doing this job, in one capacity or another, for a long time. She knew this place and she knew these nights. And she had chosen, years ago, some accommodation with whatever the South Corridor held. I told her about the camera appearances, the path, the stone, the sounds, and my name. I told it to her in sequence, calmly, the way I've told it to you. I watched her face while I told it. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "Did you go out to it?" I said no. She said, "Good." And then she said something that has occupied a particular space in my memory ever since. She said, "Everyone hears it eventually. Most people turn." She said it without drama, in the same practical register she used for everything. She poured her coffee. The conversation was done. I thought about asking her more, what she meant by most people, what happened to the ones who turned, how many people had held this job before me and for how long. I decided not to ask. There are questions that have answers you can use, and questions that have answers you'd only carry, and I had enough to carry already. I worked my extension week without incident. The camera appearances stopped during those final 7 nights, which I noticed but did not draw conclusions from. The path remained as it had been. I checked it once more in daylight on my final full day, and it was unchanged, extending 30-something feet out from the tree line with its flat terminus. No stone. On my last morning, I packed my truck in the cold, shook Carla's hand, nodded to Priya, and drove down the 2-lane road out of the park. I watched the tree line in my rearview mirror until the road curved and it disappeared. I had an ordinary feeling, or something close to ordinary. The specific tired relief of leaving a difficult place, the way your body starts to exhale when it understands that the sustained alertness is no longer necessary. About 40 miles down the road, on a straight stretch of highway with flat countryside on both sides, I turned the radio off. I do that now. I drive without the radio on, and when I walk past windows at night, I don't look at tree lines. And when I'm somewhere very quiet and something speaks, wind, settling structure, whatever it is, I don't turn toward it. These are small accommodations. They don't cost much. They have become habit the way any habit becomes habit, through repetition until they are simply the way I do things, and I don't think about them most of the time. Most of the time. There was a question I started asking myself in the weeks after I left that job, and I'll share it with you because I think it's the most honest accounting of what the experience left me with. The question was this: if I had turned, if I had pointed my flashlight at the tree line and called out a response to my name being spoken in the dark, what would I have found? I have never been able to answer that question, and I have increasingly come to believe that not being able to answer it is the point. Whatever was in that corridor, whatever was clearing that path, setting that stone, building those appearances on camera 4 across 11 weeks of cold nights, it needed something from me. It needed a response. It needed me to orient toward it, close the distance, cross the line I'd agreed to keep. And whatever it would have offered me in return, recognition, contact, something I can't name, it would not have been mine to keep. It would have been the beginning of an exchange, and I have no way of knowing what the terms of that exchange were or who had agreed to them in the past. I drove away. I drove north and stopped at a motel and slept for 11 hours, and then drove the rest of the way to the town where I was living and walked into the rented room and called my wife. We worked things out, eventually. Not immediately and not easily, but we did. I'm home now, which is a word that means more to me than it used to. I sleep well most nights. The things that matter to me, the coffee in the morning, the sound of the house settling, the particular quality of my wife's voice from the other room. These things have a weight and a presence that I understand better now than I did before that job. Better than I would have if I had stayed. That's the best I can offer you by way of a conclusion. I don't have an explanation. I have a sequence of events and a series of choices and the fact of having come through it in a condition I recognize as intact. That's what I have. It's what most of us have, I think, when we're honest about the things that have tested us. The park is still there. I assume the corridor is still there. I assume the path is still there, or some version of it, patient and maintained, and extending a little further into the cleared area each November. As the leaves come down and the nights get cold, and whoever is sitting at that desk in the visitor center at 11 o'clock starts to notice a particular dark gap between the tulip poplars. I hope they don't turn. I genuinely, honestly hope they don't turn.